a timely deep dive, right? With that finance exam coming up next month, we figured this is just what you need to really get those tricky concepts down. And hey, speaking of tricky, we know the University of Lego's delaying resumption has kind of thrown things up in the air.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a waiting game, hasn't it?
For sure.
Yeah.
But hang in there, everyone. Pray for the best. Don't panic and focus on what you can control, like absolutely acing this exam. So today, let's unravel the mystery of interest. Why does it even exist? Is it just plain old greed? Or is there something more to it?
Well, it's fascinating, actually. Economists have been going back and forth about this for centuries. They've come up with a bunch of different theories.
Really?
Yeah, each with their own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so no easy answers then.
Not exactly. But that's what makes it so interesting, right?
For sure. So let's break these theories down one by one. Where should we start?
Let's kick things off with the productivity theory.
All right, the productivity theory. From what I'm seeing here, it basically argues that interest exists because capital, like tools and machinery, makes labor more productive.
Exactly. The source even gives this super clear example.
Oh, yeah.
The amount that labor produces with the help of capital goods is generally larger than the amount it can produce when working by itself.
Okay, that makes sense.
Think about it. You can build a house way faster with power tools than if you're just using a hammer and nails. So businesses are willing to pay interest to borrow that capital because they know it'll help them produce more and in the end make more profit.
Okay, I get that. But wouldn't that also mean that the more capital there is out there, the less businesses would be willing to pay for it?
Yeah.
Like if everyone has a power drill, maybe they wouldn't be so desperate to borrow yours.
You're totally right. That's one of the criticisms of this theory. It doesn't really look at the supply side of capital.
Ah, I see.
And it also has trouble explaining interest on loans that aren't used for production, like those consumption loans you mentioned earlier.
Right? Like if interest is only because capital boosts output, why would anyone pay interest to borrow money for vacation?
Precisely. A vacation might boost your happiness, but it doesn't necessarily boost the economy's output, right?
Good point. So productivity is definitely part of the puzzle,
Yeah.
but there's clearly more to it. What about this next one? The abstinence or waiting theory. It seems to focus more on the savers, not the borrowers.
You got it. This theory, championed by Nassau Williams Sr., argues that interest is the reward for delaying gratification, you know?
Okay.
Like you're putting in the work for that exam instead of hitting the beach.
True.
You're delaying gratification for a future benefit, that shiny finance degree.
Touche. Okay. You got me there.
Mm.
I hadn't thought of it quite like that. But wouldn't that mean someone who has a ton of money wouldn't really be sacrificing that much by saving? They wouldn't experience the same abstinence as someone who's struggling to make ends meet.
That's another criticism of this theory. You're right. It's hard to objectively measure that sacrifice.
I see.
Later, Alfred Marshall actually preferred the term waiting instead of abstinence, recognizing that all productive activity involves delaying gratification to some extent, whether it's a farmer waiting for their crops to grow or, you hitting the books for that finance exam.
Okay, so we've got productivity and this concept of waiting, but still no complete answer. What about this next one? The Austrian or agio theory. This one seems to get into human psychology a bit more.
Absolutely. This theory, developed by Eugen von Broombauwerk, basically boils down to this. People naturally prefer to enjoy things now rather than later.
Yeah.
He used the term agio to describe this premium we put on present consumption.
So it's like choosing between a delicious plate of jollof rice today or the promise of a plate next week. Most people would probably go for the instant gratification, right?
Exactly. And Broombauwerk outlines 3 main reasons for this time preference. First, present wants just feel more urgent and real than future ones. Second, we tend to underestimate how much we'll want something in the future. And third, the goods we have now can be invested or used immediately to create more goods, which adds to their appeal.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So this agio, this time preference, it explains why lenders demand interest. It's like the price borrowers pay to satisfy their immediate needs.
Precisely.
But how do we actually measure this agio? It seems like a pretty subjective thing.
You're right. That's one of the criticisms of this theory. It can be tricky to quantify this time preference in a way that allows us to really pinpoint interest rates. Now, building on these ideas, we have Irving Fisher's time preference theory.
Okay, this is where it starts to get really interesting, right?
He argued that the interest rate is actually a balance between people's willingness to wait, which is similar to Broombauwerk's time preference, and the potential returns from investing.
Okay, I'm with you.
Imagine you have 2 choices for investing your money. One offers a small but steady stream of income. The other promises a much bigger payout, but you have to wait longer, and there's more risk involved.
So like choosing between a safe, low-yield savings account and investing in a potentially high-growth but risky startup, I could see how my willingness to wait would totally depend on factors like my income and how certain I feel about my future earnings. If things are tight right now, that big payout later might be more tempting, even if it's riskier.
Exactly. Fisher argued that individuals weigh these factors and choose the option that best suits their time preference and risk tolerance.
Okay, that's interesting.
Higher potential returns would justify a longer wait, and vice versa.
This is giving me a lot to think about, especially in terms of my own financial decisions. Okay, so we've covered several theories now, and I'm starting to see some connections. They all seem to acknowledge that interest is about balancing the desire for immediate satisfaction with the potential for future gains. But how do we go from these individual preferences to understanding interest rates on a larger macroeconomic scale? That's where the classical theory comes in, right?
Precisely. The classical theory developed by economists like Alfred Marshall and Arthur Cecil Pigou takes a more straightforward approach, arguing that the interest rate is simply the price at which the supply of capital meets the demand for capital. Think of it like the market for any other good.
Right.
The price is set where buyers and sellers agree.
So like a balancing act.
Yeah.
The demand for capital comes from businesses wanting to invest and generate profits. But they need to believe that those profits will outweigh the cost of borrowing, which is the interest rate.
Exactly. And on the flip side, the supply of capital depends on people's willingness to save. If people are saving a lot, there's more capital available, which could lead to lower interest rates.
So it's this constant push and pull between how eager businesses are to invest and how willing people are to postpone gratification and save their money.
Right.
But doesn't this assume that money itself is just a neutral tool? What about the demand for money?
That's a key criticism of the classical theory. You're right. It doesn't fully address the role of monetary factors like the supply of money in influencing interest rates. And that's where the loanable funds theory comes in, which expands on this concept of supply and demand, but with a broader focus.
So it's not just about physical capital like machinery and tools.
Exactly. The loanable funds theory developed by Wicksell considers all sources of money that can be lent out. Savings dishoarding, which means people deciding to spend money they'd been holding on to, and even bank credit.
So it's a more comprehensive view of the capital market.
Mm-hmm.
And the demand for these loanable funds comes from different sources, right? Like governments needing to fund projects, businesses wanting to expand, individuals taking out loans for things like buying a house or a car.
You got it. And the supply comes primarily from savings, but also from dishoarding and bank credit, which can significantly impact the availability of loanable funds. It's this complex dance between these various forces that determines the interest rate.
Wow, it's way more complicated than I initially thought. But wouldn't this theory also have the potential for things to get out of whack? Like, what if people suddenly become really hesitant to lend or borrow?
That's another valid criticism. This theory, like the classical theory, can sometimes struggle to provide a clear and unique solution for the interest rate, especially when unexpected events or market psychology come into play.
So we get these theories focused on productivity weighting and the supply and demand for loanable funds. But I'm getting the feeling there's a whole other perspective we haven't even touched on yet. One that really dives into the role of money itself. Am I right?
You are. And that's where John Maynard Keynes and his liquidity preference theory come in.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into this one. It sounds like it could really change how we think about interest rates.
Yeah, Keynes really shook things up with this one. He shifted the focus from the real economy, like goods and services, to the role of money itself.
Okay.
He saw interest as less about productivity or waiting, and more about the price people are willing to pay to hold their wealth in a less liquid form.
Okay, I think I'm following, Kit. But what exactly is liquidity preference? Why would anyone choose to hold cash, which doesn't earn any interest, over something like a bond that does? It seems a bit counterintuitive, especially with that finance exam looming.
It might seem that way at first, but Keynes actually identified three main reasons for holding cash.
Okay.
The first is what he called the transaction motive. You need cash for your everyday expenses.
Right, of course. Like grabbing lunch at the University of Lagos cafeteria when it finally opens back up.
Exactly. You got to have that cash on hand for those daily transactions. Then there's the precautionary motive. Think of it as holding cash for unexpected things. Medical bills, car repairs, just in case.
That makes sense, especially with all the uncertainty around resumption dates. I bet a lot of students are feeling that precautionary motive right now.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got transactions and precautions covered. What about the third motive?
Yeah, what's that?
That's the speculative motive. This one's a bit more strategic. People hold cash because they believe they can make a better return by waiting for a more favorable opportunity.
Oh, I see. So if I think interest rates are going to go up, I might hold on to my cash now so I can buy bonds later at a lower price and get a better return. It's like playing the stock market, but with cash.
You got it. It's all about trying to time the market and get those maximum returns.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm starting to see how these different motives could drive the demand for money. But how does liquidity preference actually affect those interest rates?
Well, Keynes argued that the stronger the overall desire to hold cash, the higher the interest rate will be. It's classic supply and demand. But in this case, it's the supply and demand for money itself, not just for capital for investment.
So if everyone's feeling a bit uncertain and holding on to their cash, lenders can charge a higher price for parting with their money. That makes sense. But it seems like he's really going against that traditional idea of interest as solely determined by savings and investment.
Exactly. Keynes really changed the game by emphasizing the role of money and those psychological factors in driving interest rates.
Wow. This liquidity preference theory is really making me rethink how interest rates work. Are there any downsides to it, though? Any criticisms?
Of course. No single theory can perfectly explain everything. Some argue that Keynes' theory focuses too much on the short term and neglects long-term factors like technological advancements or demographic shifts that can also affect interest rates over time.
So it's like trying to understand the entire ocean by just looking at the waves on the surface. You're missing those deeper currents and tides that shape the whole system.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. Another criticism is that Keynes's three motives for holding money while helpful might be a bit too simplistic. Real-world decisions about holding cash are often driven by a bunch of different factors: psychological, social, economic. Hard to neatly put them into categories.
It's like saying everyone who eats jollof rice does it for the same reason. There's so much individual variation.
Exactly.
Okay, so while liquidity preference is a powerful concept, it's not a perfect predictor. But, stepping back, I'm noticing a pattern here. We've looked at all these different theories, and they each have their own strengths and weaknesses. It's like they're each shining a light on a different part of this complex thing we call interest.
That's a great observation, and it really highlights something important. Economics is all about understanding different perspectives, not about finding the one right answer.
Yeah, I like that.
Each theory gives us valuable insights, and by considering them all together, we get a much richer and more nuanced view of how things actually work.
That's a helpful way to think about it. It's not about picking a winner. It's about using these theories as tools to analyze real-world situations.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to look at in our next segment. We'll dive into some of the criticisms of these theories and explore how they can be applied to those financial decisions you face every day.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so we've explored all these theories of interest, productivity, waiting, time preference, supply and demand, even the desire for cash itself. But now I'm curious, how do they actually work in real life, especially for our listeners getting ready for that finance exam next month? How can these theories help them understand the choices they're making right now?
That's a great question. Let's start with something every student can relate to: student loans. Why are you paying interest on that loan? Think back to the abstinence or waiting theory.
Okay.
Someone out there had to save that money. They had to delay their own gratification, so it could be lent out to students like you. The interest you pay is kind of their reward for waiting.
That makes sense. It's not just some random fee. It's connected to an actual trade-off someone made.
You got it. And from the lender's side, Fisher's time preference theory comes in. They're looking at their options. Should they lend that money to students or invest it somewhere else? The interest rate reflects their desired return and their assessment of the risk.
So they're weighing the potential benefits of helping students invest in their education against other investment opportunities. I never thought of it like that before.
Now imagine you graduate, land that dream job, and you decide to invest some of your earnings. How can these theories help you make smart choices?
Well, the productivity theory would suggest I look for investments that boost overall output and create a good return. Maybe I invest in a company developing some new technology or creating jobs, not just chasing the highest return, but thinking about the bigger picture.
Right. You're not just looking at your own profit, you're thinking about the impact of your investment on the economy as a whole.
Exactly. And remember the classical theory and the loanable funds theory? My investment decisions actually contribute to the demand for loanable funds, which affects interest rates in the wider market. It's like my choices have a ripple effect on the whole system.
You got it. It's all interconnected.
Wow. It's pretty amazing to think about.
And let's say you're thinking about buying a house. Understanding Keynes' liquidity preference theory can be really useful here.
Oh yeah, how so?
Changes in interest rates, driven by things like central bank policies or overall economic conditions, can have a huge impact on mortgage rates.
So if people are feeling uncertain, like with the whole University of Lagos situation, and holding on to their cash, that could push interest rates up and make my mortgage more expensive.
Exactly. These theories aren't just some abstract ideas in a textbook. They can help you understand what's happening in the real world and make better financial decisions.
It's like having this secret decoder ring for the whole financial system.
I love that analogy. But remember, the real world is always more complex than any one theory can capture.
Right. It's not about finding the one right answer, but about using these theories to ask the right questions.
Absolutely. And for those of you studying for that finance exam, think about how these theories might show up on the test. Could you use the productivity theory to explain the impact of government spending on infrastructure? Or the liquidity preference theory to analyze how central bank decisions affect interest rates?
Great examples. So to all our listeners out there, especially those at the University of Lagos dealing with the delayed resumption, remember knowledge is power. Don't just memorize these theories, really try to understand them, challenge them, and see how they connect to your life and your future.
Maybe one of you will even come up with the next groundbreaking theory of interest.
Wouldn't that be something? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of interest rates. Good luck on those exams, everyone. And stay curious.